There's a road just outside our town. No name, no sign, just endless trees and a dark reputation. Joe and Rhys, cousins with a knack for adventure, learned the hard way why no one dares to drive it after sunset. Tonight's story is not just another campfire tale. It's about two best friends, Joe and Rhys, who ignored every warning and paid the price. If you think you'd be brave enough to face the unknown, stay with us. But I'll warn you, by the end of this, you might think twice before ever taking a detour. Joe and Rhys were cousins, the kind of duo that didn't scare easy. They'd laugh off ghost stories, mock urban legends, and go out of their way to prove they were above such things. So when Rhys's older brother casually mentioned the Nameless Road, it wasn't a warning, it was a challenge. "No one drives it after dark," his brother had said. "Not unless they're looking for trouble." That was all Joe needed to hear. "Trouble," he'd said with a grin. "Sounds like our kind of road trip." Rhys had hesitated. There were stories after all. Cars breaking down for no reason, drivers swearing they saw people or things on the side of the road. And then there were the disappearances. People who went down the road but never came back. But Joe wasn't the kind of guy to back down. "Come on, man," he said. "What's the worst that could happen?" The answer, as they'd soon find out, was worse than anything they could imagine. The two friends set out just before sunset, armed with flashlights, a couple of energy drinks, and Joe's beat-up old Jeep. The road wasn't on any map, but Rhys's brother had given them vague directions. "You'll know it when you see it," he'd said, and they did. The pavement abruptly turned to cracked asphalt, and the streetlights stopped altogether. Trees crowded the edges of the road, their twisted branches forming an almost solid canopy overhead. Even in the dim light of dusk, it felt like stepping into another world. "Creepy enough for you," Rhys joked, though his voice wavered. Joe just laughed. "This is nothing." The first hour passed without incident. They joked, played music, and even made a game of trying to spot something spooky. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy, and the silence outside the car became oppressive. Even the Jeep's headlights seemed dimmer, their beams swallowed by the darkness. Then came the first sign of trouble. The radio cut out. Static hissed through the speakers, loud and jarring. Joe fiddled with the dial, but every station was the same, just static. "Old car," Joe muttered. But he didn't sound as confident as he had earlier. They drove on, the silence inside the car now as thick as the darkness outside. That's when they saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road, barely illuminated by the headlights. It was a woman, her back to them, wearing a long, tattered dress. Her hair was matted, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Joe slowed the car. "Should we see if she's okay?" Rhys shook his head. "Let's not." "Come on, man," Joe said. "What if she needs help?" As they argued, the woman turned her head, just her head, to look at them. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Then she smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that seemed to stretch far too wide. Joe slammed on the gas and the Jeep roared forward. But the woman didn't disappear into the rearview mirror. Instead, she seemed to glide after them, her feet never touching the ground. "Joe, she's still there!" Rhys shouted. Joe didn't look back. "I see her!" They drove faster, the Jeep's engine whining in protest. Finally, the woman vanished, melting into the shadows. But the relief was short-lived. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the same trees, the same darkness, repeating like a loop. "Are we going in circles?" Rhys asked. Joe shook his head. "We haven't turned. This road is straight." But it wasn't just the road that seemed off. The Jeep's clock blinked, stuck at 9:13, no matter how much time passed. And the trees, They seemed closer now, their branches clawing at the sides of the car like skeletal hands. The final straw came when the engine died. The Jeep sputtered once, twice, then went completely silent. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving them in total darkness. "What the hell, man?" Rhys said, his voice rising. "What do we do now?" Joe tried the ignition, but it was useless. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe we wait until morning." But morning felt a lifetime away. And then they heard it, a soft tapping on the window. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone's fingernails against the glass. "Don't look," Rhys whispered. Joe couldn't help himself. He turned his head, and there she was, the woman from the road, her face pressed against the window, her grin wider than ever. But now her eyes were bleeding, dark rivulets streaming down her pale cheeks. Joe screamed, and the woman's mouth opened, revealing a black void filled with the sound of static. It wasn't just in their ears, it was in their heads, drowning out every thought. Rhys grabbed Joe's arm. "We have to run!" They bolted from the car, plunging into the forest. The static faded, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps behind them. But when they turned, there was no one there, just the darkness and the faint outline of the road. They kept running, branches scratching at their faces and arms, but no matter how far they went, they always ended up back at the car. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to trap them. Finally they collapsed, out of breath and out of hope. The woman appeared again, standing just a few feet away. But now there were others with her, shadows with glowing eyes, emerging from the trees. They surrounded Joe and Rhys, their grins identical to hers. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice echoing like a chorus. Joe and Rhys were never seen again. The Jeep was found a week later, abandoned on the Nameless Road. The engine was intact, the gas tank full, but the seats were covered in deep claw marks. Locals say the road takes what it wants, and if you're foolish enough to drive it after dark, you'd better pray it doesn't want you. Subscribe if you dare, or watch the next story if you can sleep after this one.